So, Molly, I was informed very seriously that if I call you Moll, it'll end badly for me. Are you an anti-nicknames person?
I am both generally an anti-nicknames person and specifically opposed to that nickname in particular. And yes, whoever gave you that advice, like I'm going to reach through this newfangled computer setup and
rip my face off. Excellent.
It's weird they have that option
exact
here.
some wrath remotely from Washington, D.C.
M-Slice it is.
I did not know that you had a particular antipathy to that nickname. I think I was just picking up like a general anti-nickname vibe.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think in general, that nickname is one that I would associate with like a
20s
diminutive.
gangsters.
No, yeah,
No.
right. It made like Miller's Crossing.
Yeah, exactly.
Like a gun mall.
The classic Moll.
Yeah.
I don't know what that comes from. That is what they call like the girlfriend of the gangster in old gangster movies.
I didn't know that. We can add that to my list of reasons to oppose that nickname.
Oh, okay. This is from Wikipedia. So gun is British slang for thief, which is derived from Yiddish, apparently. And Moll is a euphemism for a female sex worker. So there you go.
Well, you know what? That is a very good reason. That is a nickname. You found one. My mother's, who has two sisters, I should note 3 daughters in the family, her maiden name was Call. And so they were always the Call girls. To every creepy neighbor they had growing up their entire childhood.
That's unfortunate.
She took my dad's name right away. She's like, on principle, I didn't want to, but I just felt like it was the right move at that point. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am one of your co-hosts, Scott R. Anderson. Thrilled to be here in the studio with one of my other regular co-hosts, Quinta Jurassic.
Hello.
And thrilled to not be here with my other co-host,
Rude.
Who remains in Arctic North, although it looks quite nice out your window there.
It's so nice.
It looks
I've
lovely.
been watching the tree put out leaves behind you.
Because Alan is now completely silhouetted by the light coming in through the back window. A dark, shadowy figure that joins us once a week on this podcast.
I really need to get like a ring light or something. Like, this is not working.
But we're happy to have you here, Alan. Glad to have you back.
Hello, hello.
And we're thrilled to be joined with one of our favorite special guests, our Lawfare and Brookings Institution colleague, Molly Reynolds. Molly, thank you for coming back on Rational Security.
It's good to be here back in this physical studio.
Exactly. In the physical studio with us as well. So the 3 of us are here. The temperature is slowly rising. It'll be about 98 degrees in this tiny room by the time we're done. But that's okay. It's worth it for you all. We do it for you, the listener. And if Molly's here, you know that we are here to talk about just one thing. Congress.
True.
We're thrilled.
Yeah, I can't deny that.
Because Congress has had a very busy week, but it is not the only big news happening in the national security space over the last few days. So we are excited to break it all down, or at least 3 of the bigger or more interesting items to us down with you, the listener, this week in what we are calling the Pun Moll edition, in honor of the little piece of information that we learned and hopefully is shared with you in the B-roll of this episode. Our first topic for this week: Shattering the Must-Pass Ceiling. Earlier this week, President Joe Biden and Speaker Kevin McCarthy announced a deal on raising the debt ceiling and thereby avoiding a potential financial catastrophe. The question now is whether they can sell it to enough members of Congress, where right-wing members of McCarthy caucus are promising to sink it. Will the deal make it through? And if not, what might come next? Topic 2, Recep Tayyip Erdo-won. He won. After a close fought contest, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdo-won has emerged victorious from runoffs in Turkiye's national elections, positioning him for a 3rd term in office and a 3rd decade in power, the beginning of the 3rd decade, not all the way through the 3rd decade. Does the re-election of the increasingly autocratic figure mean the further decline of Turkish democracy and Turkiye's flagging relationship with the West? And topic 3, I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid that's not regulation.
That was good.
I thought that was pretty good.
That was good.
The head of several leading AI developers are actively urging Congress to regulate the industry, even as they continue to roll out new products to the public with visible errors and not much product testing that take huge leaps and bounds in AI technology. How seriously should we take this plea? What is the right approach? For our first topic, Alan, let me hand it over to you to get us started.
So I'm just going to quickly run through the high-level points about what is in the debt ceiling deal, and then I'm going to pivot to Molly for her to explain what is happening in Congress. So the top line is that this deal, which still needs to get through the House and the Senate, preferably by the June 5th, quote unquote, deadline, would suspend the debt ceiling until January 2025, so through the next presidential election. It would do so in exchange for that. There are some, I would call them surprisingly modest limits on spending. So basically, discretionary spending is frozen for a year. It then gets to be increased by 1% the next year. And then within discretionary spending, basically the military is fully funded, veterans benefits are fully funded. Where you do have spending limits or spending decreases, they're again quite modest. So you have an increase in the work requirement for SNAP. Obviously, that's a big deal for the people who are on that program, but it's not that much money. You have clawback of, I think, $30 billion in unspent COVID funds. You have the IRS is not getting all the money that it was going to get to go for tax enforcement. The student loan repayment pause has to end. So, not trivial things, but things of sort of, I think, much smaller magnitude than what I think Republicans were hoping for, especially after they passed their own much more draconian debt limit increase. Though, of course, at the same time, the deal does represent President Biden also going back on his pledge to not negotiate with the Republicans and demand a clean debt ceiling increase. So that is the deal. I think at the end of the day, not a huge thing, though obviously good because it does extend the debt ceiling. So having now gone through the highlights of what's in it, as promised, Molly, where is this thing, especially with respect to the House?
Sure. So let me talk about sort of where it is at the moment that we're recording this, which is the middle of the day on Wednesday, which is to say that, we have this piece of legislative text, which importantly contains much, but not all of the things that have been reportedly agreed to between congressional Republicans, really House Republicans, and President Biden. So Alan, for instance, mentioned the clawback of some of the funds allocated to the IRS as part of last year's Inflation Reduction Act. A very small amount of that rescission or, rolling back of those funds is actually in this bill. Much more of it is in sort of a separate handshake agreement that, again, is sort of in place, but is not actually part of the formal legislative text. But that piece of legislative text will come to the floor in the House tonight. First, before the legislation actually reaches the floor for its own vote, there will be a vote on what we call a special rule. This is, how Congress usually brings large pieces of legislation like this to the floor. The most important thing to know is that at various points over the past several days, there was, gnashing of teeth, wringing of hands about whether some of the Republicans on the House Rules Committee would try to block passage of the bill by obstructing the rule in committee. That didn't actually happen last night. So it's going to come to the floor in the House tonight. To me, the biggest question is not sort of does it pass the House, but how many votes does it get? It will need some Democratic votes to pass. It will not get enough votes from Republicans on its own. And so then just the real question is, how many Republicans vote for it and how many Democrats vote for it. From there, it'll go to the Senate. Alan mentioned the sort of June 5th X date that Secretary Yellen put out on the table towards the end of last week. The hope is that the Senate will, in fact, get it done. Before that, that will probably require a kind of what we call a negotiated time agreement where folks in the Senate will, get to offer amendments in exchange for not objecting to a more expeditious consideration of the legislation. So they won't have to jump through all of the sort of formal procedural hoops that are required when you use cloture, which is the process of using 60 votes to end debate on something in the Senate. So that's kind of where we are procedurally. And so probably by the time folks listen to this, barring something unexpected that would surprise me at this point, I'll go ahead and say that, the measure will have passed the House and will probably be in the process of moving through the Senate.
So one question that I have had about all of this is, There seems to be a kind of debate among folks who have been following this closely over whether this is sort of within the realm of normal political horse trading, or whether the mostly implicit but sometimes explicit threats by Republicans to tank the global economy by breaching the debt ceiling sort of moves it into the realm of impermissible hostage taking. And
so I think the answer to that is
What do you think?
Yes and yes. I mean, so I think here it's helpful to like put this fight we've been having in like a little bit of broader context. And here I want to rewind the clock all the way back to 2011, which is the last time we saw a fight over the debt limit sort of this magnitude. Folks may recall that in the summer of 2011, we went through sort of a similar episode where newly empowered House Republicans, they had just taken the majority, took the debt limit hostage, and we ultimately ended up with the Budget Control Act, which imposed a decade, so much longer than the spending caps that Alan mentioned earlier that are a part of this deal, a decade of spending caps. We can sort of talk more about that if you all want. But one of the things that Republicans and Democrats took away from that 2011 episode were really opposite conclusions. So Democrats looked at what happened in 2011 and said Republicans should never be allowed to take the debt limit hostage again, full stop. Republicans looked at the 2011 episode and said, hey, this didn't go as well as we would have wanted when we took the debt limit hostage, but it's got us more than really any other fiscal negotiations over the last decade did. So like, let's take the debt limit hostage again. So that was sort of part of how we got to where we are. I want to say unequivocally that sort of taking the U.S. economy and by extension the global economy hostage to attempt to extract spending cuts is like not a responsible way to govern, but also kind of where we ended up with this agreement, I think is largely where we would have ended up had the debt limit not been something that needed to be addressed this summer, simply because Republicans control one house of Congress. Come September, we would have needed to get a deal that would have prevented the government shutdown. And I think on the spending side, on the discretionary spending side, like the agreement that came out of these negotiations looks a lot like the agreement that we would have gotten in the fall. I do think that the sort of scope of conflict that we've been going through over the past several weeks was broader because we were talking about the debt limit than if we were just talking about the prospect of a government shutdown. There's a lot of discussion about how much permitting reform was going to make it in this deal. Ultimately, a very small amount, particularly a project of importance to one Joe Manchin of West Virginia. There are changes, as Alan mentioned, to work requirements for SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Those are consequential for people who will now be exposed to work requirements, mainly adults between the ages of 50 and 54. It is also true that Democrats in the negotiations were able to secure exceptions to SNAP work requirements for veterans, people experiencing homelessness, and their homelessness for the purposes of SNAP is a very broad definition. Also for youth aging out of the foster care program. So the Congressional Budget Office has actually said that the number of people who are likely to be eligible for SNAP under these provisions will be more than it is now.
Do they know that would happen? Is this like a happy accident, or like someone is really, really clever?
Let me wrap up, and I'll answer your question. The other thing I'll say,
what is happening?
Yeah, so the thing I'll say though is that because this is also a year when Congress needs to act on the Farm Bill, which is the piece of legislation that reauthorizes SNAP, it's entirely possible that we would have had this whole work requirements fight or a version of this work requirements fight as part of that legislative fight. So like, I think we sort of moved the pieces around a little bit, but I think we sort of ended up more or less where we would have in the fall, while still saying that like no one should take the debt limit hostage. To answer your specific question about SNAP, so I will say importantly, one of the White House's lead negotiators on this package is a woman named Shalonda Young, who spent 14 years as a staffer on the House Appropriations Committee before becoming the deputy director and then the director of the Office of budget. So a person who knows deeply sort of where all the levers of the federal budget are. I have no idea if sort of folks knew specifically that CBO was going to come out last night and say, hey, under this provision, 78,000 more people per month are going to be eligible for SNAP. I don't know if folks knew that number. Maybe they did. There are lots of smart people who work in this space. And it certainly was the goal of the White House and of congressional Democrats to protect especially vulnerable populations who might otherwise be hit or exposed to these work requirements. So yeah, that's, I think, what I would say. It would shock me if anyone was surprised. I don't know if they sort of knew that that's what the sort of the number would be.
So Molly, I want to ask you a question that I think is going to be particularly something that arises from the situation that I suspect you may have strong feelings about, but I want to know. Is this a sign that maybe we've been underestimating Kevin McCarthy's influence?
So here's what I think.
And intelligence.
Here's the place.
And maybe intelligence, although,
Here's the place where I think folks underestimated Kevin McCarthy. I'm not even sure I would say underestimated. But so if I were to sort of lay out a set of pivotal moments for how we got here, I would start actually with what I said from all the way back in 2011. The next thing I would say is the fact that Democrats, and again, we can talk about why, chose not to address the debt limit themselves last year when they controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House. And then the third pivotal moment for me is when in April, House Republicans did manage to come together and pass something everyone knew was never going to become law, but something that did in fact contain an increase to the debt limit. And many people, including me at times, I will own up to this, did not think Kevin McCarthy was up to that task, was up to the task of finagling his conference to agreement on anything that contained any language raising the debt limit. And I think once that happened, it really meant that President Biden could not continue to say, like, I am not going to negotiate with these people. And so I suppose that's an underestimation of Kevin McCarthy. Again, I think that that was a place where people really thought it was possible he wasn't going to be able to do that. And then when he was, I think it really changed the trajectory of the negotiations.
I'm also curious, my reaction to this deal is that I think it's kind of giving away a little bit more of the weakness of the Republican position around the debt ceiling and their leverage over it. I'd be curious of your thoughts about that, somebody with deeper historical knowledge, because this is a pretty modest deal. Like, it's definitely some wins for the Republicans. That was always going to happen if there's going to be some sort of deal, but it's a heck of a lot, if you were to draw a median point between no changes and what the Republicans originally passed in their deal, it's closer to no changes. That wasn't the opening offer necessarily for the Biden administration. There was no negotiations period. They had to make some compromises there. But this is a deal that McCarthy is now able to sell through his caucus. And that seems to show that
some of them. So there is some segment, and by the time folks are listening to this, we will know how large this segment is. There's some segment of the House Republican Conference that will not vote for this. Some of them will not vote for it because they were never going to vote for anything that raised the debt limit, or they were never going to vote for anything that did not make implausibly large cuts to the non-defense side of the discretionary budget. There will also be people who vote no on this, who are in the so-called vote no, hope yes caucus.
Nancy Mace.
I don't know about Nancy Mace.
Specifically, I think so.
She has
she lives in that caucus.
She's a history of saying she's going to do one thing and then doing something different on a number of high-profile votes this spring. But yes, there will be people who will vote no, but ultimately hope that the deal passes. So I think he will be able to sell some element of his caucus on that. I mean, I think the way to think about this is if you are, and I should put my cards on the table, I think we should get rid of the debt limit. I think that having this sort of hostage floating out there in the world is not good for a responsible budget process, for the health of the U.S., for the global economy. So if it were up to me, I would wave a magic wand and eliminate the debt limit. But if you are a person who believes that the debt limit is a way to periodically force the U.S. Congress to make hard fiscal choices, this agreement does not sort of bolster that case.
Right.
It's, as you put it, like relatively, certainly in comparison to the Budget Control Act as drafted in 2011, a relatively small package. When you sort of look at the projections about what it will do to our long-term fiscal picture, it makes like a small dent in the debt to GDP ratio and its growth over time. And so it's not going to do a whole lot in that sense. And so, I mean, I guess from my perspective, you could say that that's kind of weakening some of the Republican, at least rhetoric around why should we still have a debt limit at all?
So while it may very well be that McCarthy has been underestimated in terms of being able to wrangle his caucus, it is true that because of a decision he made to become Speaker in the first place, it only takes one member to potentially kick him out of his speakership. How likely do you think that is going to happen? I mean, is Chip Roy, right, from Texas, who's very conservative and very angry, and is he gonna pull that trigger? And if not him, then Matt Gaetz or Lauren Boebert or someone else, George Santos, if he ever comes back to DC.
Yeah. So what Alan's referring to is this change that was made as part of McCarthy's negotiations to get elected Speaker that made it easier for a single member to bring a resolution declaring the chair, so the speakership, vacant to the floor. I don't actually think this is terribly likely to happen. I think for a couple of reasons. One, I think so there are certainly people in the Republican conference who are very angry about this deal and are shouting about it in all kinds of forums. But I think that many Republicans do realize that, this is what they were going to get and don't actually want to default. And so will ultimately either affirmatively vote for the deal or go along or sort of be in this like vote no, hope yes group. I also think that there's the folks on the sort of most extreme end of the Republican conference, for this to work, they would need to have kind of a plausible alternative and a plausible sort of theory of how they would govern the House differently than McCarthy has. And I just don't see that happening. And you can sort of, if you read these quotes from when people in that part of the conference are asked about whether they would try to declare the chair vacant, they are sort of, there's a lot of passive voice in them that suggests that while they are angry, they sort of recognize the limits of their ability to use that particular tool. And it's, also probably helped McCarthy that a number of people who have been kind of big bomb throwers on the right end of the caucus in the past have come out and said, this, Jim Jordan has said that, we're going to vote for this. So.
And one last aspect of this, I wonder if this outcome kind of sheds some interesting light on. There's a column from Jennifer Rubin who has become like a very unlikely in terms of historically her writing, but recently like very committed Biden booster, and wrote a column that I don't know, sure I 100% agree with, but I generally agree with, which basically says like people don't appreciate Biden's acumen as a negotiator, that he was able to get this deal. And I actually think that's true. I think Biden is a very savvy negotiator. He's got very savvy negotiators working with him in the White House, particularly around legislative matters where the man himself just has epic amounts of experience and was an effective legislator himself for a long time. But beyond that, I wonder if I think we have signs that they actually have a read on the Republican caucus that the people outside didn't. Because I think this helps explain why they repeatedly ruled out quite expressly 14th Amendment options, printing the platinum coin, all of these other options that a lot of people say, and I think there's an argument for it, are legally available. Probably will get challenged in the courts, would lead to a legal fight, a lot of ambiguity, uncertainty that would still cause economic harm, but those options are still there. And you had a lot of people saying, well, why don't they say, oh, we're going to do this anyway to have leverage? And I think that their calculus was, we have to bind ourselves to the mast to make clear we're not going to do this as far as we can. There's never a way they could totally rule it out. By coming out publicly and saying we don't think this is legally feasible strikes me as good as you can get. And saying that we're drawing a line in the sand, we're binding ourselves to the mast. We don't think the Republicans will ever actually do this. And that's what they did. They won a game of chicken in this in a lot of ways. And it's really actually pretty brassy, and the extent to which they are able to win with really surprising little concessions and get the caucus on board, it's really telling. And I actually wonder if this becomes the new Democratic strategy and a model for that, which I think it might. Certainly, this seems like one of the more successful negotiations Democrats have had around the debt ceiling. that's a hard argument for the Republicans to come back on. Like, they kind of showed their cards again.
Yeah. So I guess a couple things I'd say in response to that. So one is sort of, I do think that it mattered that at the end of the day, like, Joe Biden is a person who wants to make deals. He's like that's like what he is.
Very true.
And I think, again, if you compare this to, say, the negotiations between President Obama and John Boehner in 2011, President Obama went into that much more about, like, I want this. They called it the grand bargain. I want this big 10-year agreement. They had revenue on the table in a way that revenue, like, we never talked about revenue in the context of these negotiations. And that was much more about, like, how can we, the 2011 negotiations were much more about, like, how can we change the overall fiscal trajectory of the country? This is much more about, like, from the Democratic perspective, how do we avoid global economic catastrophe in the form of a default? And how do we minimize the damage from having that is inherent with the fact that, like, we have to get this through divided government. So that's one thing I would say. The thing that I think really constrained Republicans in this whole process is the fact that rhetorically, it was very important to Republicans to be able to vote for cuts to spending. But they also, not all of them, but a sizable portion of the party does not want to cut defense spending.
Right.
So if you don't want to cut defense spending, we've also in the course of these negotiations seen veteran spending sort of get its own kind of conceptual place in this. So if we weren't going to cut defense spending, we weren't going to cut veteran spending, but we needed to cut things, then that suggests that there's, like, one place in the budget where we're going to cut things, which is from the part that doesn't have defense and doesn't have veterans. But then you also need to write something that you're actually going to be able to get through the Senate. And so that was sort of this, like, squeeze from both ends, which I think is, again, part of how we ended up in this place where defense spending for the next 2 years is going to be at higher levels than it was last year. Effectively, if all the handshake agreements are effectuated into, like, actual handshakes, we'll get roughly flat non-defense spending. And then we have 4 years of non-binding spending targets after the 2 years of firm caps. That's kind of, I think, how we kind of got to where we are.
So let me wrap up by asking about the future of the debt ceiling. I think we all agree, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I think we all agree, if I'm not mistaken, that this thing sucks and should go away. And there seem to be sort of two different ways that might happen. Sort of one way is that Congress could just repeal the debt ceiling. And I'd love to hear Molly's thoughts on when that might happen. And if Democrats have finally learned that the next time that they are, fully in power, they have to get this done. And I also want to ask Scott about, interesting wrinkle about the 14th Amendment argument, which you are correct. Joe Biden did sort of say he was not going to try to use, but not because he didn't believe it would work, but because he was worried that it would take too long and the courts might not support it, et cetera, et cetera. And, one thing I have heard chatter about is that the 14th Amendment solution is still in principle on the table, which is to say that once this debt ceiling limit extension has passed, President Biden could also just declare the debt ceiling unconstitutional and then try to get the courts to decide that question. Now, there's interesting standing and mootness and ripeness questions and that sort of thing. But I'm curious from your perspective, Scott, whether you think that's also a viable way to test whether or not the debt ceiling even is constitutional. I mean, for the record, I think it probably is constitutional. And so I don't think that's going to actually work in the long term. But I'm curious what you think about that. So I don't know. Let's do Molly first on the legislative side and then Scott on the judicial side.
Sure. So you're absolutely right that the debt limit is a statutory limit on the public debt. Congress could write a new statute that says there's no longer a limit on the debt. Last year, when there was a lot of discussion of whether Democrats were going to do this under unified party control, I thought the most likely way that they would defang the debt limit was to pass what I would call a comically large increase to the debt limit, like astronomically large number. The consensus is can be done using the budget reconciliation process. So could be done like the not a repeal of the statute, but a comically large increase to the statutory limit on the debt.
Comically large it's a technical term.
Yeah, it's my preferred technical term, comically large.
I'm just thinking of like Dr. Evil going $1 quadrillion or something.
That's exactly what I want you to
the little pinky thing.
In this context. And so I probably continue to think that like if they were going to do it, that's the way they would do it, because then you can do it without needing votes of the other party. In terms of I'll say one thing in terms of your question to Scott, which is that to me, the biggest drawback to using any of the extraordinary measures that have been talked about is the fact that if you use them when you've actually reached the X date, when you use them at the point that the Treasury Department can't use its regular extraordinary measures to manage its cash flow, then you are in a place where you do the thing. There's uncertainty about the legality of the thing. And so you incur a lot of the negative economic consequences in terms of the market reaction of having done the thing without the certainty that it's definitely going to work. That fundamentally, that calculus for me doesn't change if we're in the world that you've just outlined, Alan, which is after January 1st, 2025, which is when so basically the way that the bill works is that the debt limit is suspended until January 1st, 2025. At that point, the sort of limit will return at whatever level of debt the U.S. government has incurred by that point. And then that will usher in another period of extraordinary measures by the Treasury Department. So there's some language in the bill that I don't know enough about that I think seeks to limit the Treasury Department's ability to build up cash in the intervening, not quite 2 years, to sort of make it harder for them to have a really long extraordinary measures period in 2025. But I'm sure someone smarter than I am will tell us more about that in the coming weeks. But that's kind of my reaction to the whole debate over the extraordinary measures.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I mean, I do think there is a potential role for these legal arguments and that they soften the landing, they buy time. They're not a resolution unless the Biden administration were to win in court and you'd have a long period of undesirable uncertainty until you get there. That is suboptimal. But it's a better option maybe than straight out defaulting if you didn't get a deal. And I kind of suspect if no deal were forthcoming, the Biden administration, despite having publicly disavowed them, would settle on one of these legal arguments and pursue it, precisely because it is a better alternative than complete outright default that everyone accepts. Well, there's nothing to be done about it. That said, I think that my guess is that they really rule these options out as much as they can, which is, again, limited. Like nothing can prevent the president from changing his mind saying, oh, we're going to pursue these legal arguments. But I think they ruled them out to bind themselves to the mast, to really commit themselves to this game of chicken with the House Republicans in particular, to say, nope, we're going to go for this. And we're compromised maybe a little bit here and there, but in the end, don't think you're going to actually follow through with this. Now, what that means for getting rid of the debt ceiling is another issue. I'm not sure how you raise the constitutional question unless you're actually at the end of the debt ceiling, because anything else would be kind of an advisory opinion. So it'd be very easy for a court that's reluctant to weigh into uncertain constitutional territory. And I think a court would be reluctant here. I mean, this would rely, at least in the 14th Amendment case, rely on a broad reading of the 14th Amendment that would upset or at least substantially constrain how we've understood a really fundamental power of Congress, right? The power of the purse. And so I think courts are going to be hesitant to weigh into that. And, because without a debt ceiling that actually makes that resolution relevant, I'm not sure a court's likely to step in. And this is setting aside even standing questions, but just on a mootness issue and say, well, look, I mean, this dispute actually isn't an issue. There's an advisory opinion, something we're prohibited from giving, unless you're actually at the end of one of these negotiations. So I don't think the legal argument actually, at least the 14th Amendment argument, gets you out from under this. Now, could the Biden administration print a platinum coin and saying, well, we don't have to worry about the debt ceiling anymore? Yes. And that would kick off a legal argument over that question. But I strongly suspect the Biden administration would give themselves far leaner odds of emerging from the courts victorious if they did that outside the context of a crisis. I think a lot of that argument hinges on a fairly generous reading of a statute and related regulations, if I recall correctly, but I think primarily the statute, and then says, we don't think a court's actually going to second guess our reading of the statute in the context of an emergency. Take away the emergency, I suspect that's not a fight that they are really excited about picking, because it's a lot easier for courts to say no, and there's no consequences for us right now. You're just prohibited from printing this platinum coin, or it doesn't mean what you think it means. So I don't think there is a way out of this outside of legislative action, or we hit a real crisis point, and that's when the courts feel like, well, we actually have to step in and resolve that. That's not unusual. That's actually like a feature of our constitutional system. That's what, principles of constitutional avoidance and the prohibition on advisory opinions gets us. That is a situation that arises, but it comes with a risk, and it is, unsatisfactory for many of us who are worried about that actually reaching that crisis and what it could mean.
Well, from one troubled democracy to another. So we recently saw the second round of the elections in Turkey, where Recep Tayyip Erdo-won did indeed win, which is a great victory for everyone who didn't want people to use the hard G, because the alternative was that he was Erdoğan, which would have been, of course, inaccurate.
That was the alternative.
Exactly.
Title.
So it seemed like initially that the opposition might have had a real chance of beating Erdoğan. It was a real squeaker in the first round of the election, but in the second round, the opposition candidate who'd gotten the second support, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, I think I'm pronouncing that right, managed to not quite be able to pull it out, and Erdoğan won re-election with 52% of the vote. It's worth saying that, he did win, but he won with an enormous amount of state support and press support backed by the state behind him. And so there's a cartoon I saw from a Turkish cartoonist that essentially had Erdoğan, running to victory, and Kılıçdaroğlu having to vault over a series of jumps in order to get to the finish line. And I think that's sort of a useful way to conceptualize what exactly happened here. But, the victory is concerning insofar as Erdoğan is a figure who has really consolidated power, moved sharply toward authoritarianism in recent years, presided over earthquake in recent months that had just an appalling casualty count among Turkish citizens because of government failures to police construction and to arrive and provide relief when the earthquake did happen. And so I think that's kind of a bleak story in terms of, an autocrat triumphing. And so there are a lot of questions about what this means for Turkish democracy. There are, of course, also a lot of questions about what it means for the West's relationship with Turkey. So, Scott, let me turn it to you first. What do you make of Erdogan's victory?
Yeah, this is an outcome I think a lot of people were dreading, but nobody thought was outside the realm of possibility, or really outside the realm of likelihood even. As you noted, Erdoğan is a very troublesome figure on lots of levels. He is domestically very much increasingly autocratic and authoritarian. Still have functional elections in Turkey. I don't think we should assume that he doesn't have a substantial degree of popular support, maybe enough to have won this election outright. Anyway, obviously the margins were very close, in part because of the recent earthquake and in part because of other concerns. But the guy has a very strong popular base still in Turkey. And Turkey does still have functional elections with a lot of caveats about how the press is handled, things like that. That said, he really has put his imprint on lots of state institutions, installing loyalists through the judiciary, purging the military, arresting many, many academics and commentators and journalists, particularly since the 2016 coup attempt, that really proved to be, I think, a kind of seminal event for him and how he sees his role in the Turkish society and Turkey's role in the world to some extent. And kicked off a high degree of paranoia for him and his closest supporters, it seems. So it's troublesome to see him continuing in office. But in the end, I do think it strongly suggests a continuation of the status quo, which is a relationship that a lot of the world has learned to manage, which is why, it's not surprising, but you saw a lot of world leaders say, we look forward to continuing to build our relationship with Turkey, with Erdoğan as its head, because that's what the EU and the United States have done. That relationship is a lot more complicated than people thought the U.S. and EU-Turkey relationship was going to be in the 1990s before Erdoğan came to power, when Turkey seemed to be on a trajectory that was much more headed towards the West on a lot of fronts, economically, socially, things like that. But, it does mean that Erdoğan, we have that continuity here. It's worth noting, Erdoğan also, this is not a sign of extreme strength for him. He won this election by very slim margins. He is still under heavy criticism for managing the earthquake aftermath. Turkish economy is in complete disarray and is likely to become even more so in the near future, simply because he did a great deal of kind of pumping money into the economy to kind of inflate a lot of day-to-day economic factors that's likely to result in even more dramatic inflation and other economic woes in the months and years to come. But he's gotten out of that in the past through relationships with Gulf states and other countries, sometimes Russia, that lend certain amounts of economic aid, work trade deals, do a lot of other things where he leverages the international position of Turkey to try and compensate a bit domestically for some of his more, less reckless policies domestically. And we may see some more of that. And again, it doesn't seem like anybody is not bought in the region to maintain a relationship with Turkey, because they can't, because Turkey is a very important state. It's geographically important, politically significant, militarily significant, and has a lot of influence. And Erdoğan knows that and leverages that in an incredibly ruthless transactional way that looks completely erratic if you look at it from the outside and think of a country as the sort of thing that likes stable relationships and alliances and long-term stability in how it interacts with the world. Erdoğan doesn't really mind that, care about that nearly as much as other leaders. He's very willing to horse trade left and right and to leverage every little bit of it. One open question I do think this leaves is what happens to this opposition movement we've seen that had a real electoral success. I mean, securing 48, 49% of the national vote, is pretty notable. But it was a very broad coalition brought together for this particular moment. Who knows what a defeat here will mean or how Erdoğan will approach it later. You could see perhaps Erdoğan saying, well, oh man, these groups really have support. I better try and do some things to be politically friendly to their constituencies and address some of their concerns to undermine that support, and therefore might not, crack down on them. Or you could see them go the other way saying, well, I bet with my state apparatus, I can really crush some of these groups and get them to not be an issue anymore. And that's really something to watch, and is something I think the United States and European countries will be concerned on, because one thing they are going to want to see is actually meaningful political, if still inherently pretty flawed, competition in Turkey, and the opportunity to do that. The fact that you can still have elections is really important for that relationship. And I think that the fact they've been under threat has been a point of real stress. But that said, it's worth noting, we saw this opposition movement take some weird turns, particularly in the lead up to this runoff. You saw the leading candidate come out and say some pretty horrendous things, really, about Syrian refugees, threatening to return all of them to Syria, something that would be humanitarian catastrophe and hasn't been suggested by others, but playing this very strong populist angle, because a lot of Turks blame the Syrians in the country for economic woes and for other issues, rightfully or wrongfully, almost certainly wrongfully. So, it's not clear that that strikes me as a bit of a desperate move. And yeah, they were trying to win in this last gasp of the race. But it's also maybe a sign that there's not a lot of sticking room or common agenda if you're not able to go up against Erdoğan, and maybe that won't be enough next time. So I think that's the biggest question for me, is saying, well, what happens to the opposition now? What kind of environment does Erdoğan provide to them with his control of the state apparatus? And then how does their internal dynamics allow them to continue or not?
Yeah, I just want to chime in, not because I know anything about Turkish politics, but because I want to highly recommend a podcast that came out, well, I guess it would be yesterday on Wednesday when you're listening to this, by Lawfare legal fellow Serafin Dinani, who interviewed a Turkish commentator / journalist on the election. And it goes into a lot of depth on the domestic politics of this, why Erdoğan was able to squeak it out, and some, I think, really interesting discussion of how this was not fundamentally an election about sort of economic issues, although obviously those are important and ever present, but rather kind of a referendum on the loyalty of Erdoğan's kind of personal base, which remains very strong, which unfortunately therefore does not augur well for the future of Turkish democracy. Kind of, honestly, in a very similar way that the strength of Donald Trump's hold over a particular, portion of the Republican base out of clear personal loyalty does not augur anything terribly good about American democracy. It's just that, Trump lost and Erdoğan won. So, elections have consequences, as they say.
So another aspect to this for U.S. policy has to do with NATO, as ever, and the sale of F-16s to Turkey from the United States. So Erdoğan has been trying to get a hold of new F-16s. Congress has so far not been crazy about that idea and has held it up in large part, I believe, perhaps entirely, because Turkey has been blocking Sweden's entry into NATO over what Erdoğan claims is Sweden's harboring of terrorists. And Scott, you've talked in the past about how that concern is maybe not like 100% on the level. So I guess my question is, now that Erdoğan has won re-election, what we might expect to see now? I mean, Molly, do you have a sense of whether the Biden administration would be kind of able to lean on Congress to get them to ease up and let the F-16 deal through, or if they would want to?
I don't. I mean, I think that one challenge in a lot of contexts related to Congress is right now is that the debt limit has just like consumed so much of the oxygen in the room. I do think that some of the Republican rhetoric over the past couple of days notwithstanding, both the White House and congressional Republican negotiators think that like people took the negotiations seriously. So it's not, I don't sense that for like the overall relationship between Congress, particularly Republicans in Congress or the White House, this was a like burn the bridges to get the deal done moment. So that's probably like all else equal promising for subsequent work between the White House and Congress. But I do think that because all of the energy was about trying to avoid global economic catastrophe, maybe now we can redirect some of that energy to other things.
Yeah, and this is kind of a different situation for the Biden administration in a lot of ways, because one of the biggest, most vocal opponents to this is the Democratic chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez. He's been very vocal about drawing a hard line on Turkey. This has been longstanding. Remember, Turkey, part of the reason they are kind of in the shit with the United States, for lack of a better way to put it, is because they basically just straight up ignored CATSA violations. This is a statute that Congress enacted in the waning days of the Obama administration, early days of the Trump administration. I can't exactly remember when it happened. I think early days of the Trump administration, and installed a bunch of statutorily required sanctions on states that, among other things, engage in defense relationship with Russia. Turkey went ahead and did it anyway, deepened that relationship. Trump administration kind of slow-rolled sanctions, never really slapped anything on. I actually don't know the current status of that. And so it's been one of these sorts of questions saying, well, like Turkey's really doing something that we really drew a line in the sand. And Menendez was very involved in that effort, saying, you know, you're not supposed to be approaching Russia on these security relationships as a NATO member. And Turkey went ahead and did it anyway. And then Menendez takes that issue seriously, as he should, honestly, as FRC chair. Interesting, what I've read from reporting, although I actually haven't seen a direct quote on this that I can recall off the top of my head, Mike McCaul, who's the Republican chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has said that he's open to sales moving forward. And my recollection, I'm actually double checking this now, is that they're the two people who have the sort of informal holds on this process. It's interesting arrangement. I wrote an article about this in 2019 in the context of the Yemen arms sales the Trump administration pursued. There's no actual formal authority to issue the sorts of holds Congress is doing in this place. It's a handshake agreement between the executive branch and Congress, where Congress basically gave the executive branch a very broad statutory authority to do arms sales, but said and reached this handshake agreement to say, but we understand we're going to be able to put holds on this. And that if you ignore our holds, then eventually we're going to rescind this authority or otherwise limit it. There is also a process for rolling back or blocking sales more formally, but that requires a majority of both chambers and a supermajority if it's vetoed by the president, which is what happened in the Yemen arms sales debate ultimately.
So one thing I'll just say, Scott, because you brought this up, is that while in this context, there is this sort of like specific form of a norm where the chairs of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee have this sort of agreement with the executive branch. This does also illustrate, particularly in the Senate, more generally, the degree to which individual senators, if they get sort of worked up about something, can exercise all kinds of formal and informal powers to prevent it from happening. See one Tommy Tuberville and many, many nominations to Defense Department posts right now. And so that is certainly also a like dynamic that's at play here. That this is an illustration of.
Absolutely. So it's going to be a tricky road, I think, for them to hoe. it seems pretty clear that the Biden administration, although they expressly say they're not doing this, it really does seem like they're very much, there's a bit of an F-16 for Sweden trade on the table here. And so the real question is, well, what can they do to get the Senate on board and the House on board with that, letting this go forward? I don't think they will do what the Trump administration did do and ignore these holds. I think that would be a big move, particularly for Biden, a former Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair, to do something like that. But, they're going to probably put some leverage on them to find some way to move this forward. And that might involve other concessions, other issues that they'll adjust priority. And so it's going to be a bit of horse trading. But we have a timeline because I think the goal, as I understand, is to try and get Sweden's joining NATO on board before the next big NATO meeting, which is just a few months away. And so the hope is now that we're past this election, Erdoğan might be a little more flexible and they can put pressure on that. And that's going to be the next big bilateral issue. But it's a sign of things to come because Erdoğan, we know his pattern at this point. The guy is transactional and shameless about it. And this is going to be the reality of Turkey being a NATO member and general Western ally, which it still is, just a very complicated one, moving forward. That can be very valuable to have people willing to play that kind of shameless role. That's why Turkey's a good interlocutor with Russia, because it's willing to maintain relationships with Russia in a way other states aren't. But it's always a lot of energy to maintain those relationships. And that's the reality that we're all be living through over the next several years until maybe there's another turnover at the next Turkish election, although I kind of doubt it. Well, talking about governance issues, we have had a little bit of discussion about governance issues here in the United States, but not the ones you might be thinking of. No, not governing us, governing the other intelligence coming down the pike, if you will. The new intelligence that will replace us all, the artificial intelligence that is writing racist messages for us, and not to mention our resumes and work emails as we speak through ChatGPT and other apps that are now widely available and in wider and wider use by the day. Specifically, we saw at a hearing, I think about 2 weeks ago now, in Congress, and most recently in a letter signed by most of kind of the leaders of the AI industry, most of the leading developers of AI, suggesting that we need to see more federal regulation around AI issues. In particular, the letter strongly suggests that the big AI issue everybody needs to concern about, it's not even a letter, it's actually kind of a one-sentence statement everybody agreed on, is this idea that AI could prove a sort of existential threat at some point down the road to the human race, and that we need to take that into account as we kind of approach it and manage its development responsibly. But notably, none of these concerns, which appear to be, heartfelt by both the companies involved and lots of other people. We've seen several prominent people resign from Google and other companies that were working on AI issues over these sorts of concerns in the past few weeks and months. They don't seem to be stopping any of these companies that co-signed this letter from developing these new technologies, incorporating them, releasing them, making them publicly available. And there's no real signs of that being in the offing, at least as of yet. There was discussion about a temporary 6-month pause that I don't believe was taken up by many people. And so it's not clear what this actually means in terms of the business operations of these companies that are developing the technology that their leaders claim to be concerned about. Alan, let me start with you on this, as I know this is an issue you've spent a lot of time watching and tracking closely. What do you make of these calls? And what is, the state of the AI regulation push? Is it even something really realistic at this point, or is that still a little ways down the road?
So for a number of reasons, I don't think regulation is going to happen anytime soon, nor do I think it necessarily should happen anytime soon. Because again, right, it's just not clear what you are regulating. And if you're going to regulate anything, you should just regulate at the endpoint, which is to say you should regulate the uses of AI in specific domains, right? So I think, talking about regulating large language models in general is much less interesting and much less useful and much less tractable than talking about regulating the use of AI in, the criminal justice decision-making or in medical care or in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my thoughts on the issue of regulation. What I think about these sorts of statements in general is, look, I don't think they really mean all that much. The fact that all these people could get behind is a one-sentence, very vague statement that AI is a big deal and is concerning is just, I think, not terribly relevant. At the same time, I don't think it's super useful to sit and criticize these companies for simultaneously developing these technologies at a breakneck pace while also talking about how dangerous they are. Now, or at the very least, I don't think it's a useful argument to say, oh, therefore we shouldn't take seriously what they say about the dangers of these technologies because they're trying to develop them. That's a sort of kind of tu quoque, ad hominem argument that I just think does not really tell you anything useful. I mean, of course, they're developing these as quickly as possible. First, they're engineers and they're scientists and they want to build stuff. That is a natural human desire. And also the competitive market pressures are such that it's very hard to coordinate. I mean, it's literally impossible to non-collusively coordinate with these companies to somehow retard the development of these models. Maybe it would be better in an alternate world if the government ran this. I mean, I think that raises its own concerns. But for better or for worse, we are developing these models because they're interesting and potentially world transformative, and human beings are going to develop interesting future-based things. That is part of the dynamism of our species and culture. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And at the same time, we can also be quite worried about it. For what it's worth, I am kind of generally optimistic about the field of AI alignment, which is what this is called, right? This question of making sure that AI ultimately serves human purposes, not the other way around. Though, again, as is always in these conversations, I like to note that I look forward to when our robot overlords take over, and I will be the first one to help them when Skynet wakes up, I assure you. The fact is that there is a lot of societal consensus, both at the level of the folks that are developing this and at the level of policymakers, that this is a world historical technology that we need to spend a lot of time thinking about and a lot of time researching. And I have to say the Senate committee hearing where they invited, Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, and some other AI folks, I found that to be quite encouraging. I listened to it. It's a good discussion. There was very little grandstanding. There was clearly a desire of these politicians to be educated and to think about what to do. But it's obviously going to take time to figure out how to regulate a technology this fundamental, just like it took more than 6 months to figure out how to regulate electricity or regulate the internal combustion engine or regulate, the printing press and all the complexities that came from that. So that is a grab bag of not terribly coherent thoughts on AI alignment. I'm
sorry. I'm so sick of this trash. This is ridiculous.
She's talking about you, Helen.
Yeah, I'm talking about.
That's very clear.
Look,
wow.
My thoughts on this.
Maybe I'm glad I'm in Minnesota and not in the room with Quinta.
Look. So there's a tweet from Dylan Matthews that has about this that had a picture of Nathan Fielder from Nathan For You, and the text is: "The plan is simple: raise money for my already wildly successful AI company by signing a petition stating that the company might cause literal human extinction." And frankly, that's kind of where I'm at, and I think it is important for two reasons. The first is that I actually do think that it is absurd to build something and then say, ooh, it might cause human extinction. Please give me more money. That's just stupid. You could just not do it. The second, and I feel like we should have learned that by now. The second thing is that focusing critique and alarm on we might cause Skynet, we might end up in a I have no mouth and I must scream world, moves attention away from the actual harms that are already being carried out by AI, and which addressing would require, actually scrutinizing these companies' business models and creating actual problems for them, rather than just consolidating their position at the forefront of the industry. And by that, I mean looking at the business model of running these models with, private information that's not transparent, looking at the ways that generative AI, like all kinds of AI systems, tends to reproduce societal biases, looking at the carbon footprint, for example. And these are not, things that I'm pulling up off the top of my head. These are critiques that have been made by a number of people, including, among other folks, Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell, who were Google researchers who worked on their ethical AI team and were fired for raising these concerns in a paper with Emily Bender that's called Stochastic Parrots and is about the potential harms of AI along these lines. And all of those folks have been really raising hell on social media, saying this focus on quote unquote existential risk is just absurd, and that it is strategic and that it does draw attention away from, the existing concrete substantive harms that AI can and is causing. There's a story just this morning about website that was using AI as a chatbot for people who are in recovery from eating disorders. And guess what? It turns out if you do that, the chatbot starts giving you suggestions about how to lose weight. So they've now shut that down. But like, these harms are not speculative. They are very immediate, and we don't have to go all sci-fi to start thinking about what it means to be, you know, concerned about these issues. I will also say, counter to you, Ellen, I was kind of bummed by the coverage of the hearing for exactly the reasons that you indicated. Actually, I think Altman came off very well. We also learned that he and OpenAI went around to a bunch of congressional offices and gave people a demonstration of ChatGPT ahead of time. And there's very much an element of, I think, the committee buying into what Lee Vinsel, who's a technology scholar of technology studies, calls criti-hype. So criticism and hype that feed into one another, right? Like saying, oh, this is so powerful, it could potentially destroy humanity, is another way of saying, this is so powerful. Please give me more money. Please allow me to help design regulation of the field at which I am already the leader. So I'm completely sick of it.
So I will jump in here and say one thing in sort of moderate defense of the United States Congress, which is that my sense is that unlike some of the other arising and current tech problems, this is a place where Congress actually is making what I read as like a good faith effort to get ahead of the game.
Yeah, that's totally true.
And basically or I should put it, to like not end up totally behind the eight ball. And I'll say this both in the context of sort of this broader regulatory question, but also in terms of the implications of generative AI for Congress's own operations. That's something that people are taking really seriously for sort of both the promise and the possible pitfalls of that. And so I can't help standing up a little bit for Congress when the time comes. But your totally reasonable broader critiques notwithstanding, I do think that there's at least a little bit of evidence that sort of Congress has learned a little bit from its previous pitfalls in terms of trying to come in very late in the game on tech regulation. So I'm at least a little bit encouraged by that.
You know, I tend to share Quinta's fairly skeptical view of the organizational incentives here. This just strikes me a little bit of hiding the ball. I don't think that means that there isn't some space for thinking about these further out problems or questions, but to pretend like those are the urgent questions raised by this emerging field of technology that is rapidly becoming available and being deployed in lots of ways without much product testing or frankly forethought, it seems like, that just strikes me as a bit of a distraction. Where I think the pushback comes is where we've seen it come in other emerging technology, which is a lesson that every 1L and almost every law school in the country has received, but may not have realized they're receiving. It's called your torts class. Because if you notice, most of your seminal torts cases are based upon new technologies or what were new technologies at the time: rail cars, automobiles, spotlights, things like new medical technologies, right? And when you have these new technologies come out, they come out with flaws, they hurt people, and those people then sue the pants off the companies that produce them. I don't think we're far off from that now. We had an article that was just published today in Lawfare by Herb Lynn, kind of noted computer expert and cybersecurity expert in Lawfare, pointing out that ChatGPT is generating misinformation specifically about him and that he has a problem with it. I know this is the case because I've Googled a couple of close associates of mine, including my wife, through ChatGPT, and they make up whole stories about them in very peculiar ways. I don't know how systemic it is. I don't know if you get the same results across other people, so there might be a question of harm or injury. But we're not that far off from getting plaintiffs around these things. And that creates this dynamic where you will see these tech companies, A, have to begin to wrestle with these real social harms they have. And then B, begin to say, well, look, if we really want to develop this technology, you need to give us some safe harbors, Congress, like Section 230 did for internet developers, honestly, in a lot of ways, where they're going to say, otherwise, when we're moving this quickly, developing a technology that everybody accepts, I think, has some real positive potential upsides, if we may not accept whether they're outweighed by the potential costs, they'll say, well, we need to have some safe harbors. We need to have some sort of lines about where we know we can continue to develop this technology without having to face these wide unknown litigation risks in our very litigious society. And that's going to be a point where there's going to hit a real pressure point on Congress to do something. It's not going to be around, Skynet. It's not going to be about AI replacing the human race. It's going to be about AI slandering people, defaming people, leading people astray, and doing a lot of other things that cause very cognizable harms. So I think this is a little bit of a distraction. It's interesting. It's fun to talk about. I do think it's an outside risk people should think about to some extent. But I think the real regulatory conversation is a few months or years away and is going to be forced on these companies, not driven by them.
So I guess, and first, I just want to pay obeisance to a good Quinta Juresa grant. They are things of beauty, and I always love to hear them. I guess what I just find puzzling is the idea that attention is somehow like we've hit whatever the maximum amount of attention is, and now we're just splitting the pie between sort of short-term harms and long-term harms. And I don't think that's right for two reasons. First, and maybe this is just my vantage point as like a law professor, but I've read, dozens and dozens and dozens of research papers and law review articles about AI in the last several years, and every single one of them is about the sort of retail harms. And when I say retail, I don't mean unimportant, right? But like they're not pieces about Skynet, right? They're not pieces about alignment at a 60,000 foot view, right? They're pieces about the things that Quinta is rightly concerned about: bias, discrimination, sort of all the kind of, again, retail harms that AI can cause. And that's great. But what there, I think, isn't actually is a lot of this bigger picture thinking. So, I'm not sure that this will extinguish the attention paid on these smaller scale harms because there's so much attention paid on them. And second, again, I'm just not sure that it's a zero sum thing, right? If you think, and I tend to, that AI is like a world historical transformative technology, we should just be paying more attention to it as a general matter, right? And, I get that like no one likes tech billionaires. I don't particularly like them either, but they have opinions and they're worth listening to. And I don't think it's that hard to both say, yeah, Sam Altman has some smart things to say about existential AI risk. And also we should be very skeptical about, OpenAI's monetization strategy with Bing. Like I can do both of those things at the same time. I think most sophisticated people can. I think Congress can. And so I'm finding this sort of vituperative response to what is a kind of a milquetoast statement to be like, to be kind of odd, right? Like if you don't like these people, that's fine, but they're not wrong that there are existential risks here. And like, we should think about them because a 5% existential risk is still really big.
Well, we will have some time to talk about this before we inevitably bow before our robot overlords on this podcast and elsewhere. But for now, we are out of time. But this would not be rational security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come. Quinta, what do you have for us this week?
I would like to recommend a New Yorker article. It is by Suzy Hansen.
Shocker.
Okay, come on now. It's called Turkey's Earthquake Election. It was published on May 8th.
So it's happy is what you're saying, Quinta.
Yeah, right, exactly. So before the election, but I read it when it was published and then went back to it in preparing for this episode and just found it a really good in-depth overview of the effects of the earthquake on Turkish society and also how Erdoğan's successive kind of takeover and turning of all institutions of the Turkish government toward him and toward corruption has had a measurably negative impact on the Turkish people. So if you're looking for an overview of that, highly recommend.
Alan, what do you have for us this week?
So I am listening to a wonderful book. It's called American Prometheus. It's the biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, famous American scientist and head of the Manhattan Project, written by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin back in 2005 when he won the Pulitzer. And it's also the kind of foundation for the new Christopher Nolan biography of Oppenheimer that's coming out later this summer and is going to be very interesting. It's a wonderful read. Obviously, it's a great biography. He was a really interesting guy. The Manhattan Project, super interesting. His, political troubles in the 1950s are really interesting. But I use it as today's object lesson because, where I am like literally right now in my listening to the book is, World War II has happened. The atomic bombs have been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Oppenheimer, as sort of the de facto chief scientist of the United States, is trying to get the government to limit the use of atomic weapons, to kind of create a world government that would oversee all of this. As we know, none of this happened, and you ended up with a decades-long arms race between the Soviets and the U.S. and almost global nuclear annihilation with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's just amazing as I listen to it how similar all of the debates about AI honestly sound to the debates about nuclear weapons, right? You have these scientists who have created something for sort of the sheer joy of scientific creation and endeavor. And now that they've created this thing, they're looking around and going, oh dear, what have we done? And then they're chagrined that they can't control the thing that they have created, because that's ultimately a decision for society to make, not for scientists to make. And society is going to do what society wants to do. So, look, obviously nuclear weapons are still a very important issue today. And so it's always interesting to hear about the history of them. But it's also just such a fascinating kind of parallel to some of these debates that we're having, I think, about AI. And it's a wonderful book. So highly recommended.
Well, for my object lesson, I have been enjoying all the media coverage of the end of this show, Succession, that I've heard so much about, but really have not bothered to watch, although evidently everybody else in the world is.
I refuse to watch it. I refuse to watch shows about sociopaths being mean to each other. I don't need that in my life.
Yeah, that's kind of was my reaction too. I tried a few episodes and the first season, and there were funny moments and interesting moments, but I never really bought into it. The same reason I never really got into like Always Sunny, because I need a protagonist that I actually like on a show, I think.
There's such bad people.
Yeah, it's frustrating. But I love the amount of coverage I was getting, because all of my automated feeds were just full of Succession takes and surprising articles about Succession in every publication, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Times, the Post, everybody's writing about Succession. Most of which I ignored. But I saw an article come across from The Guardian, which I really appreciate The Guardian coming up with very eclectic, interesting, weird human interest stories, entitled Succession Syndrome Prevalent Among Wealthy Households, Psychiatrists Warn, which is an actual article that appears primarily be informed by a group called Paracelsus Recovery, which is a luxury rehab center in London and Zurich that I Googled, and it looks phenomenal, far nicer than most vacation places you've been in your life, that charges up to $132,000 a week for individualized counseling, and is describing the real-life afflictions and psychological syndromes that extremely wealthy people have that they have begun calling succession syndrome. I don't want to make light of those, because these are very serious health problems, and even extremely wealthy people deserve some empathy for dealing with those issues. But it is a remarkable portrait of a segment of life that is just so wildly different, and the resources available to treat it, particularly when you pair this article, which again appears primarily to have been a really, really impressive PR pitch by the Paracelsus Recovery Center to get them to write this article that basically reads like an advertisement for them and the important services they provide. But it's a really interesting read just about what the actual people living in this position, where so many shows are about extremely wealthy people and what they do in their life and the challenges they face. And this is a really interesting window into the reality of that, and actually some of the darker, sadder underbelly of that, including just widespread alcohol abuse and depression and other issues among the super wealthy. So next time you think to yourself, rich people, they're just like us, you're kind of right, but in a sadder way than you may appreciate. And I thought it was an interesting read to balance against all of these Machiavellian intrigue that we have become so into as a society.
My favorite comment about being rich is that the main downside of being rich is that you have to interact with other rich people. And I just thought that was such an interesting perspective.
Do you have to, though? That's the real question. You could probably get out of it. Molly, why don't you bring us home? What do you have for us this week?
All right, friends. My object lesson is an amount of gold bullion bars worth between $100,001 and $250,000. These belong to Senator Bob Menendez's wife. They were they are an asset that he amended a previous required disclosure report to say that his wife had this amount of gold. I read about this in an article on the New York Times website that is the latest in a series of reports about another potential corruption scandal involving Mr. Menendez. This one also involves a company based in New Jersey that is the sole authorized importer of halal meat into Egypt. So all kinds of different directions that this goes. I say this in part because, any article that is both about gold bullion and about the sole authorized importer of halal meat into Egypt is worth reading. But also, in case you have gotten all the way through this episode and need something else to get angry about, I will offer you the difficulty that now exists in proving that a federal official has accepted bribes, thanks to a series of Supreme Court cases that have made it much more difficult to convict people of this crime. So I will leave you with that. I don't think that's where Scott thought I was going with Bob Menendez when I told him before that this is going to be my object lesson. And I will also just say that this is the second article in the last week that I have read that is in part about gold bullion. That was my favorite of the options available to the federal government should they actually have crossed the X date, was to start selling off the federal government's gold holdings.
Oh, that seems much more plausible than printing a platinum coin or the 14th Amendment.
I'm just saying that was my personal favorite of the extraordinary options to return us to where we started.
Hey, we're floating that currency for a reason, man. If we're going to have that gold, let's spend it. That's what I say. But I'm a lawyer, not an accountant. If that wasn't painfully clear. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare. So be sure to visit lawfareblog.com for our show page with links to past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other phenomenal podcast series. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at RATL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. Also, sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits at patreon.com/Lawfare. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan. We are once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patcha Howell. On behalf of my co-hosts Alan and Quinta and our special guest, Molly Reynolds, I am Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.